There is a kind of pain that's completely silent. No screaming, no tears, just standing in the middle of the living room where Aunt Vivien's laughter once echoed, facing a stranger in a suit, turning the safe's lock as if he owned the place. "Excuse me, who are you?" The man looked up, not even trying to hide his confusion. I was authorized to liquidate the assets in this house. Everything's been sealed and will soon be transferred to the heir." I laughed, a sharp, disbelieving sound. "The heir," I repeated, my voice tight. "I am the heir." He stepped back half a pace. "And your name is Elena McAllister. I'm her niece. I've lived here with Aunt Vivien for 15 years. My name is Elena McAllister. I'm 28 years old, and as of yesterday, I officially became a millionaire. But wait, that's not the surprising part. The real shock is this. I just found out I was this close to being scammed out of everything by my own blood relatives. My Aunt Vivien Whitman passed away 8 weeks ago after an unforgiving battle with pancreatic cancer. She wasn't one for emotional words, but she left everything to me, the old estate on the hill. Her shares in Whitestone Living worth more than $14 million, plus an additional $2.4 million in liquid assets. And before I could even catch my breath from grief, they showed up. Lorraine Kingsley and Daniel McAllister, the woman who gave birth to me and the man I once called Dad. These were the two people who abandoned me when I was 13 years old. No messages, no goodbyes, just a piece of paper scrawled with 16 careless words. "Aunt Vivien will take care of you. We're sorry." For 15 years, I learned to bury the past. I once dreamed they would come back and apologize, and I've torn that dream apart with my own hands, knowing deep down it would never be real. And yet, on the very day the will was read, they walked into the lawyer's office, dressed to perfection as if they'd just stepped out of a graduation ceremony, wearing smiles as sweet as sugar cane, and speaking in the voice I thought I'd forgotten. "We are still Elena's legal parents, and we'll be helping our daughter manage such a large inheritance." I always knew they saw me as nothing more than a walking bank account, but I never thought they'd be this shameless. It's bitter. Isn't it 15 years? I wrestled with my broken dream of having a family. 15 years. They never once asked if I was alive or dead. And now that there's money, they come back as if they never disappeared. They thought I'd freeze, overwhelmed by emotions, and let them drain the rest of my life away just like they did in the past. But this time, I'm no longer that little girl curled up on the couch waiting for a phone call that never came. I am Vivien Whitman's heir. And if they want to take what she left me, then they've just opened the gates of hell without realizing it. But still, I can't shake this question. What else are they hiding behind that mask of loving parents, sweetheart? Running a company isn't like doing homework in high school. That was the very first thing he said after the will was read. My father, Daniel McAllister, still had that same condescending tone he used when I was 12 years old and accidentally dropped a glass, forcing me to stand crying in the kitchen for 3 hours so he could teach me about responsibility. Except this time, it wasn't a glass that shattered. It was the carefully constructed facade of loving parents they had always tried to wear before I could say anything. My mother, Lorraine Kingsley, sitting beside me, gently patted my hand like some kind of therapist trying to soothe a patient. Sweetheart, I know this is overwhelming, but luckily, your father and I are still here to guide you. They didn't talk about the grief. They didn't mention the 15 years I spent growing up in silence. They only talked about money, about this so-called huge responsibility. 4 words, $16,800,000. Apparently, that number was big enough to wake 2 ghosts I thought were long forgotten. I looked at them, at those unfamiliar wrinkles, at the eyes that carried no regret, only calculation. My mother tilted her head as though she was working through a strategy, not speaking to the daughter they had abandoned. "I've reviewed Colorado's probate laws," she said calmly. "Because you were never legally adopted. Your biological parents still hold guardianship rights." Ah, there it was. Their plan used a legal loophole to gain control of my inheritance. "We don't want anything," my father added, softening his voice. "It's just, if you need someone to co-sign certain documents, it would be best to have us by your side." I laughed, a brittle, jagged sound slipping from my throat like a scratch on an old vinyl record. "You haven't been by my side for 15 years. And now that $16,800,000 are involved, suddenly you want to be my support system." My mother tried switching tactics. "Have you ever thought that? Maybe we were hurting too. You weren't the only one who suffered. I almost took my own life. Elena, your father drowned in crushing debt. When we placed you with Vivien, we believed she could give you a better life." "Really?" I stared at them. "And when exactly were you planning to come back and check if I was actually okay?" The room sank into silence. But it wasn't the silence of remorse. It was the pause of recalculation. Then my father placed his hand flat on the table. "Elena, you're allowed to be angry. But at the end of the day, we're still family. No one understands you like your parents do. Don't push this too far. Family." I used to wonder if they ever thought of me at dinner, or when the TV showed some cheerful holiday family reunion. Now I know. They only thought of me when 8-digit numbers appeared in an inheritance account. "I don't need guidance," I said, my voice steady. "I've been working at Whitestone since I was 20, running the marketing department, managing over 30 employees. I stayed up all night in the hospital when Aunt Vivien took her last breaths on oxygen. I am perfectly capable of moving forward on my own." My mother sighed, like I was just some rebellious teenager throwing a tantrum. She leaned closer and whispered, just loud enough to pierce straight through me, "It's such a shame to see such a good girl let money change her." And then she added, with deliberate weight, "You'll soon realize in this world, everyone needs a family, especially when legal trouble comes knocking." That last sentence wasn't advice. It was a threat. But what they didn't know was that just a few hours later, I would uncover a piece of evidence, a tiny, seemingly insignificant detail they could never have anticipated, that would completely destroy every argument they thought they had. That night, I didn't sleep, not because of fear, but because of anger. I lay in bed alone in the room that once belonged to Aunt Vivien, staring at the ceiling with its swirling plaster patterns, clutching the worn old fur blanket tight in my hands. The faint trace of her perfume still lingered on the pillow. I closed my eyes, and the memories came flooding back. 13 years old. The last night I was still a child. I woke up late because Mom didn't call me for school like she usually did. The apartment was empty. Their bedroom door was wide open. In the closet, a few lonely hangers dangled. A note sat on the kitchen counter. The handwriting shaky, "Elena. Aunt Vivien will take care of you. I'm sorry." That was it. 16 words. No heart, No tears, and they were gone. I sat by the window until nightfall, waiting for the doorbell to ring, waiting for the familiar voice calling me to dinner, waiting for any sign that someone still needed me, but no one came. And tonight, 15 years later, I'm wide awake again. I'm no longer the little girl by the window. I'm a grown woman now, a marketing director, the rightful heir to nearly $17 million. So why, in this very moment, do I still feel as small as I did back then? They think I'll swallow this betrayal with a smile. The voice in my head spat the words, bitter and sharp. They think I'm still that timid little girl, desperate for an embrace, for an apology, so willing to hand over everything I have just to hear the words, I love you. One more time, I rolled over. Rage surged through my chest like fire rushing into my veins. No, not this time. Aunt Vivien once taught me silence is an answer, too. But sometimes, the answer needs a signature and a lawyer. I threw off the blanket, slipped on my robe, and headed downstairs to her old study. The room still held the walnut filing cabinet, its drawers carefully labeled personal finance, shares, power of attorney, legal documents. The last drawer, urgent private, was locked. I remembered she used to keep the key inside a leather-bound classic novel on the top shelf. I unlocked it, and there, lying silently like a ticking time bomb, was a thick folder. On the cover, McAllister, confidential. My heart clenched. I pulled the file out. My hands trembled, but my mind had never been clearer. Inside copies of letters from my father to Vivien demanding money, wire transfer receipts, reports from a private investigator showing they were in Atlantic City the exact weekend I was abandoned. And one thing more important than everything else, the legal adoption papers, my name Elena McAllister, legal guardian Vivien Whitman, signed and stamped by the Denver court. The year I turned 16, I sank to the floor, tears streaming down my face. Not because I was weak, but because, finally, I had proof. Proof that they didn't just abandon me. They sold their rights as parents for a sum of money. And now, they've come back, claiming they want to guide me, to help me manage the estate. No, not a chance. They declared war the moment they faked their return, I thought, gripping the folder tight. I'll finish what they started. I sat frozen at the oak desk in Aunt Vivien's study, the warm yellow light spilling across the surface like dying sunlight on a desert. Not enough to bring comfort, only enough to expose every crack. In front of me was a brutal truth, neatly arranged in folders as if she had predicted this exact day would come. Each document was numbered. Each section handwritten, the letters tilted, sharp. Decisive McAllister, extortion. First incident, Kingsley, request for medical assistance monthly transfers, $2,800. Note, no response allowed. I picked up a bank receipt, dated February, the year I was 14, sender Vivien Whitman, recipient Daniel McAllister, purpose financial support to avoid a custody lawsuit. A single line at the bottom condition stated clearly no contact with Elena. I flipped to the next page. A handwritten letter in my mother's handwriting. Vivien, you always think you're better than everyone else. But the truth is, you don't understand a mother's love. I gave birth to Elena, and if you want to keep her, you'd better think about keeping this out of court. I read every word like being pricked by safety pins, slowly, steadily, pain seeping in until I couldn't breathe. If you don't transfer $2,800 every month, I will go to Elena's school. I will tell her friends you stole my daughter. Don't force me to do this. The voice in my head screamed, no. There's no way my mother wrote this. No way. But handwriting doesn't lie. During all those years of living with Aunt Vivien, I used to think she was cold. She never hugged me when I cried, never praised me when I got an A, never sat beside me when I had a fever. She only left a glass of lemonade by my bed, only said drink enough water. Weak girls don't lead companies. I used to resent her. I used to think if only Mom were here, she'd be kinder. Now I know. I was wrong. Vivien wasn't cold. She was strong because she was fighting alone to protect me from the greed of the very people who brought me into this world. It wasn't just about money. I found an audio recording, a snippet from a call when I was 16. If you don't pay Elena's tuition, my father's voice, low and threatening, I'll file to reclaim custody. Even if it drags on for months, that's enough time for me to mess with her. Vivien's voice came back. Slow and steady, I won't let her be dragged into your games. One last document was clipped at the back. A contract hiring a private investigator. Target monitor Daniel McAllister and Lorraine Kingsley for signs of gambling relapse, credit debt, and fraudulent activities. Attached were photos my father at a casino table in Reno. My mother is in a bar uniform, slipping cash to a local bookie. All I ever wanted was love, and all they ever wanted was leverage. I clutched the file tightly against my chest, holding it as if it were the only shield I had left. Not to defend, but to strike back. They think I don't know. They think I'll stay silent for the sake of family honors. Cool. The game has changed. I brewed coffee at 5 a.m, not because I was sleepy, but because I needed clarity to start my counterattack. The rich aroma of freshly roasted coffee filled the kitchen like a battle ritual. I placed a thick stack of files on the table, next to my laptop, my phone, and Aunt Vivien's navy blue notebook, the one she always carried to shareholder meetings. Every solid strategy begins with information, she used to say, but victory comes from knowing when to use that information. I opened my laptop and created a new folder, Operation Phoenix. This wasn't just about protecting assets. This was about reclaiming the voice of the child who had once been abandoned. Step 1. Verify legal validity. I called Mr. Thompson, Aunt Vivien's longtime attorney. He answered after 3 rings, his voice deep and steady, as if he had already expected my call. Elena, I'm guessing you found the special file. I didn't just find it. I said, I want to use it. He wasn't surprised. There was a brief pause before he replied, meet me at my office at 10. Bring everything. It's time to bring the truth to light. Step 2. Allies. I needed someone who not only knew the law, but also believed me. I texted Sophie Tran, my old classmate from Northwestern, who is now a legal specialist in New York, one of the few people who knew I lived with Vivien, but never once asked why my parents had disappeared. Text Sophie, I need you. Not as a friend from school, but as someone who understands the law and the human heart. Can I call you tonight? Less than 2 minutes later, Sophie. I'm free tonight. Call me anytime. And Elena, I'm on your side. Always. Step 3. Prepare the counter-strike. I spent the entire morning backing up every single document wire transfers, handwritten letters, photographs, adoption papers, detective contracts, even the recorded phone call with my father. Everything was compressed into one master file, Whitman adoption, blackmail, full, PDF. I sent the file to Mr. Thompson and Sophie via encrypted email. Another copy was stored on an external hard drive locked inside a bank vault. A printed version was hidden under my bed. I wasn't reckless. They had sold me out once for money. I would not give them a second chance. 10:02 a.m., Thompson's law office. I walked in, holding the files, my head high. They declared war when they faked remorse, I said as he closed the door. Now I want to end this with the truth and the law. Mr. Thompson smiled not with joy, but with the bitter satisfaction of someone who had witnessed too many families turn into enemies. Vivien once told me if that day ever came, Elena wouldn't stay silent. Today, you proved her right. I placed the files on the table. They forced me to grow up too soon. Now, they'll face the version of me they created. Mr. Thompson opened the file and began reading page by page. I turned to the window, where sunlight streamed over the rooftops of Denver's financial district, a quiet city, an unspoken war, a daughter once abandoned, now ready to make her voice heard. The first day after meeting with Mr. Thompson, I did nothing. I didn't send any emails. I didn't make any calls. I didn't show up at the company. I sat in the backyard, beneath the red maple tree that Vivien had planted the year I started college. One hand holding a cup of herbal tea, the other gently brushing over the last page of her notebook, the one where she had once written, in pencil, the only line that carried a hint of emotion. Traders never notice the storm until it has stripped away everything. And she was right. I didn't need to scream to be heard. All I had to do was quietly pull one string at a time and watch them entangle themselves. That afternoon, an anonymous email was sent to the management office of the Westmont Hotel, where Lorraine and Daniel were staying. Attached a private investigator's report. It included photos, addresses, and copies of wire transfers. I didn't say a word. I merely suggested that the person they were entertaining might have been involved in several past financial fraud schemes. The next morning, they were politely asked to leave the hotel. Next came the bank accounts. I sent a certified copy of the legal adoption papers to the bank holding Vivien's trust assets. Attached was a formal letter from Thompson, requesting an immediate freeze on all access for any unauthorized parties. That afternoon, Daniel called me 12 times. I didn't pick up. He left 2 voicemails, his tone shifting as if he was trying out every possible strategy. Sweetheart, this is all just a misunderstanding. And then later, Elena, you can't do this. You'll regret dragging lawyers into this. I deleted each message without listening to the end. They once erased me from their lives with a single letter. Now it was my turn to erase them legally. That night, I checked social media. A Facebook account under the name Lorraine B. had posted an update, a photo of her crying. The caption laced with implication, when your own blood stabs you in the back, who's truly heartless below, were dozens of comments from old acquaintances I barely remembered. Stay strong. Sis. Family comes first. A mother and daughter can't just walk away from each other. I didn't respond. I simply reported the post as misinformation and smiled quietly. They still thought this was an emotional war. Meanwhile, I was playing a strategic chess game. 2 days later, Daniel called Mr. Thompson. This time, no more pretending. He wanted to negotiate. Maybe we can work out a peaceful solution. Elena could share a portion of the assets. Let's call it emotional damage compensation. Emotional damage compensation. I almost laughed when Thompson relayed the message. What do you want me to tell them? He asked. Tell them the party's just getting started? I am not a heartless person. But there's one thing I've learned after all those years of being abandoned, forgotten, treated like a burden. Compassion should never be wasted on those who exploit it. And when I saw Lorraine return to the house that afternoon, carrying a paper bag, her face pale, knocking on the door in desperation, I just stood behind the curtain, silent, watching, just like she once stood behind that door when I was 13, pounding on my parents' bedroom door, crying until my voice went hoarse. The only difference was, I didn't lock the door. I had already changed the locks 3 days ago. Everything started with a single ding, then another, then a flood of them. Like hail hammering against a glass window, my phone exploded with notifications, messages, missed calls, voicemails, emails, Messenger, iMessage, FaceTime. I glanced at the screen. Lorraine Kingsley Elena. What's going on? The bank refused to process the transfer. They said there's a legal restriction order from an attorney, Daniel McAllister. What the hell are you doing? They just froze your mother's secondary account. Do you have any idea how this affects her medical insurance? Gerald Hoffman, their hired attorney, Ms. McAllister. I strongly advise you to cooperate. We're open to renegotiating the terms if you agree to. I sighed and took a slow sip of my black coffee. Finally, the domino effect had begun. 3 days ago, Mr. Thompson had officially filed an emergency petition with the Denver County Civil Court, requesting legal verification of my inheritance rights, accompanied by proof of adoption, evidence of blackmail, and the complete private investigator's report. Not only that, but Sophie, my friend from Northwestern, had reached out to the Minor Assets Protection Committee, providing documentation that proved those people had a history of exploiting their positions as fake guardians. Within 24 hours, the bank accounts that Lorraine and Daniel had been using for support transfers to their daughter were frozen for investigation. Shortly after that, jointly registered assets, including an investment in a chain of convenience stores in Arizona, were also temporarily locked. A whole system had started moving on its own, like a machine of justice that had always needed just one push to set it rolling. 9:47 a.m. I was in the office, in the middle of our quarterly strategy meeting, when a text from Mr. Thompson popped up. The opposing party has officially requested an out-of-court settlement. Attached is the proposal. I opened the file, a 4-page document. The language was layered and deliberately vague, but it boiled down to this: if Ms. Elena agrees to redistribute a small portion of the estate, about $500,000, then the representatives of Lorraine and Daniel guarantee no lawsuits, no further claims, and full confidentiality regarding the matter. I leaned back in my chair and laughed. $500,000. After 15 years of silence, after thousands of nights screaming in my head with no one answering, after all the threatening letters Vivien had received, and now they thought they could buy silence for $500,000. No, thank you. I texted Thompson back. Make sure they understand this. Silence is no longer an option, and there's no reset button in real life. That afternoon, I happened to come across a video reposted online of Daniel standing in front of the bank, yelling into his phone. Someone had secretly recorded it from a distance, captioned "Rich Family Drama." This guy's freaking out after being denied a withdrawal. The comments were buzzing. Some people laughed. Some speculated he was caught in a scam. No one knew the full story, and I had no intention of explaining. My silence was my weapon now, and their panic was the soundtrack to a collapse I didn't even have to touch. By 7:00 p.m., I walked out of the office, the sunset spilling across each stair like a quiet pat on the shoulder. I sent Mr. Thompson one single text, initiate phase 2. I thought I was ready. After everything, after the endless phone calls, the emails, some flowery, some downright rude, the so-called negotiation offers dressed up as family affection. I thought I was immune, but I was wrong. They came for me, without warning. 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning. I was walking out of my office after a meeting with the PR team when I saw Lorraine Kingsley standing in the main lobby. Next to her was Daniel McAllister. Both of them looked so much smaller than the last time I saw them. Lorraine wore an outdated, thin coat, her once blonde dyed hair now showing dark roots. Her face was gaunt, makeup overdone, her eyes red and swollen. Daniel wore a suit, but he wasn't the confident man he used to be. His collar was wrinkled. There were deep circles under his eyes. His hand clutched a folded piece of paper, shaking, like someone cornered by debt collectors. "Elena," my mother began, her voice trembling, close to breaking. "Please, just hear me out." I stood still, keeping my distance. "We've lost everything." She continued, "We have nothing left. They repossessed the car. The accounts are frozen. Even money for medication. Even, do you know your father has severe arthritis that he can't stand for long?" Her voice cracked, as if she were talking about a good man, and I've even thought about ending it all. But you're the last hope I have left. It's you, Elena. Her voice softened, her eyes shimmered, and for the briefest moment, a tiny part of me wavered. Then Daniel stepped forward, and it was he who snuffed out everything. "You can hate us, but don't turn yourself into someone heartless. You're destroying your future by going against your family." I looked at him slowly. "My future? You mean the future you threw away when I was 13? He said nothing. I turned to Lorraine. "You call me your last hope, but for 15 years, you didn't send a single birthday card, didn't ask if I survived high school, and now, because I have assets, because I have a voice, suddenly you remember you're my mother." She said nothing, just cried. Daniel gripped the paper tighter. "You think you've won, don't forget. Vivien built everything using our family's capital. We're entitled to it." "Entitled," I laughed. "Entitled to what?" "Exactly. We're family," he roared. "We gave you life for a moment." I was silent. Then I answered, low and steady, and Vivien gave me everything else. Silence filled the space. I walked away without looking back. Lorraine's scream echoed behind me. "You'll regret this. One day you'll wish I was still around." I stopped at the doorway, turned my head, and met her eyes. "I did wish that. For a long time. But you never came." And then I left. Not with relief, but with acceptance. Have you ever stood between two people you once called parents and wondered why love came with conditions I have? And I've learned that real love doesn't come with a price tag. If you've ever felt betrayed by the very people who were supposed to protect you, share your story below. Your words might help someone realize they're not alone. And if you believe stories like these matter, hit subscribe to Bitter Scars. Here, we don't just retell the pain, we expose it, and we rise above it. I had promised myself that I wouldn't let my emotions take control. But when I held that letter in my hands, the thick ivory paper, the worn creases, my name written in that familiar slanted handwriting, something inside my chest began to tremble. Vivien Whitman, the woman who never said, I love you, but loved me in a way that made every word unnecessary. Mr. Thompson placed the letter into my hands during the meeting at the law office, with all parties present. Lorraine and Daniel sat at the edge of the table, still trying to maintain their composure, but their eyes kept darting toward the envelope as if it contained a death sentence. Vivien left this letter to be opened only in the event of an inheritance dispute, he said, and I believe that time has come. I looked at them, then I opened the envelope. I took a deep breath and began to read out loud, "My dearest Elena, if you're reading this, it likely means they've come back with their old smiles and their new masks. I'm sorry I can't be by your side right now, but I've been preparing for this day for a very long time. Your parents reached out to me, not once, but many times. They demanded money. They used you as leverage. They promised they would leave you alone if they received monthly support. I paid them, not because they deserved it, but because of you, because you needed peace to grow. When they return, they will deny everything. They will cry. They will say it's all a misunderstanding. But the truth doesn't need makeup. I've kept everything: receipts, recordings, photos, and copies of their threats. I looked up, straight at Lorraine. She sat frozen, like turned to stone. Her hands gripped the edge of her skirt, and her lips were pressed tightly together. Daniel tried to force a faint smirk, the kind of smirk people wear when they're caught but still cling to the last shred of pride. I continued reading. I loved you in the only way I knew how, through actions. And if you choose to forgive, do it because your heart wants to, not because they demand it. But if you choose to protect yourself, remember this: you don't owe them another chance. I stopped. The room fell silent. No breathing, no ticking clock. Only the slow, heavy thud of my heartbeat, like nails being driven into the wooden table. Mr. Thompson. I turned to him, my voice low but steady. Please send all the documents Aunt Vivien kept to the legal counsel, and make it clear. I looked at Lorraine, then Daniel. I am no longer the child who still hopes to have a family again. I am the heir of Vivien Whitman, and I resign from the role of silent benefactor you've exploited for so many years. Lorraine burst into tears, trying to say something, but I no longer heard her. I looked down at the letter again. The final line, slightly tilted, written by hand Vivien, not by blood, but the one who chose to love you. I folded the letter. The truth doesn't need to shout. It only needs to be strong enough to stand against every excuse. Have you ever had to choose between the truth and comfort I did, and it hurt, but it set me free? If you've ever had to walk away from a toxic relationship, share your story in the comments. You are not alone. I don't know when the word family became something hollow, not because I've grown numb, but because I tried to hold it together for far too long. Yet some things, the harder you try to mend, the more they tear apart. The news about me making Vivien's letter public spread faster than I expected. I didn't post it on social media. I didn't make any public statements. But when a copy of the letter showed up in the official legal filings, someone in the system accidentally leaked it to the local press. It only took 36 hours for a Colorado-based investigative outlet specializing in family wealth to run a headline: Vivien Whitman's adopted daughter rejects biological parents after 15-year blackmail allegations. I didn't respond to the reporters. I stayed silent. But Lorraine didn't. My mother The same woman who once scolded me for wearing ripped jeans to school went live from the living room of a small Airbnb near the airport. Her eyes were swollen, her hair disheveled, her voice breaking. I just wanted to be a mother. If I did something wrong, it was only because I loved too much. Thousands of views, countless sympathetic comments. Some people reached out to me, old acquaintances, former colleagues of Vivien, and even someone from our old prayer group at church. One person asked Elena, "Are you sure you're not being too harsh?" I didn't reply. I just forwarded them the recording of Daniel, the part where he threatened Vivien. "If you don't send the money, I'll come for the girl." After that, nobody asked again. Xander was the only one brave enough to speak the truth. He sat across from me at our usual cafe near City Park, his hand turning a latte cup slowly, as if searching for the right words that wouldn't cut too deep. "You know I've always been on your side," Xander said. His gaze lowered. I nodded, silent. "But," he continued, "I don't think I can walk with you through the rest of this." My heart stumbled, but it didn't break. "What do you mean, your family?" He swallowed hard. "There's just too much. Too complicated. I don't know if one day it's going to swallow us whole." I didn't cry. I just took a sip of my now cold tea. "You're afraid of being dragged into a battle that isn't yours." Xander exhaled slowly. "I'm afraid I'll always be an outsider." I understood, and because I understood, I didn't try to hold him back. "Then let's stop here," I said softly. "I'll never force anyone to stay out of obligation." We left the cafe, walking in two different directions. No tears, no drama, just the quiet strangeness between two people who once thought they'd build a home together. That night, I reorganized Vivien's study, the room where she used to read the newspaper, write handwritten letters, and sort through files as though she was playing a solitary game of chess. I found a small sketch tucked behind the bookshelf, a pencil portrait, unsigned, with only a single line beneath it. "Family is who chooses to stay, even when there's nothing left to hold on to." I stood there, motionless, without needing to say it out loud. I knew Vivien had understood, long before I did, that not everyone who shares your blood deserves to stay. I didn't plan for that meeting. In fact, I had decided I would never see them again. But life doesn't run according to our plans. They stood at my doorstep on an early Thursday morning. No warning, no call ahead, no permission. They simply showed up, as if they still had the right. Lorraine held a small gift box wrapped in red paper with a white ribbon. Daniel wore a long-sleeved shirt, even though the weather was already warm. "We need to talk," he said, his voice tired, stripped of its usual edge. This time, just person to person. I didn't invite them in. We stood on the porch where Vivien used to plant lavender and set a lone iron chair facing the garden. The morning breeze was cold but gentle. The silence between the three of us hung heavy, like a boulder suspended in the air. "I know," Lorraine began. "Things have gone too far. I'm not here to ask for money. I'm only asking for a chance to speak my heart." I didn't nod. I didn't refuse. I just stood there. I was wrong to leave you. Wrong not to reach out. Wrong to come back for the inheritance instead of asking if you were okay. But I'm human. I make mistakes. And Her voice faltered. "I miss you." I felt my throat tighten. Daniel spoke next. Slowly. "Maybe we don't deserve to be your parents. But, Elena, we've been watching you from afar since you graduated. When you got your scholarship. When Vivien passed away, I wanted to come closer, but I didn't dare. I let out a soft laugh, a sound without joy. Didn't dare, or didn't want to step out of your comfort zone to face the child you abandoned. They were silent. I rested my hand on the cold wooden railing of the porch. I'm tired, I said. Tired of pretending we're just a loving family that somehow lost its rhythm. The truth is, we were never a family. Blood-related, yes. But family is someone who's there when you're burning up with a 102-degree fever, not the ones who turn their backs because the hospital bill is too high. Lorraine extended the gift box. It's just an old photo album. You can keep it or throw it away. I raised my hand to stop her. Keep it. I don't need a relic from a story I had to rewrite from scratch. Daniel stepped forward, as if wanting to add something, but I took half a step back. There's no need to drag this out any longer. No tears. No explanations. I forgive myself. I don't need either of your permissions. Lorraine cried, this time not the kind of tears meant to stir pity, but the silent tears of someone who knows they've lost something they can never get back. I opened the door and stepped inside without looking back. Before closing it, I spoke loudly enough for them both to hear. The last time I opened this door for you, I was 13. And that was the day I learned how to lock it from the inside. The door didn't slam, but it carried the weight of an ending to a play that had dragged on too long. I didn't cry. I didn't feel victorious either. I just felt empty. No more waiting, no more assumptions, no more longing for an apology that would never come. And in that emptiness, I finally understood this was freedom. The house fell silent again after the door closed. No pleading voices, no more excuses, no overdue promises lingering through the cracks. Only the sunlight slanting through the curtains, spilling across the hardwood floor like a gentle caress. A pale shade of gold, not harsh, not demanding. Almost like my own emotions at this moment. They are strangely calm. I stood there for a few minutes, my back resting against the door, my chest finally loosening, no longer bracing for arguments, no longer rehearsing words sharp enough to cut yet polite enough to conceal the wound. No more practicing emotions in my head before stepping out. For the first time in years, I wasn't wearing any armor. I was simply me. After lunch, I sat alone on the back porch, where Vivien once placed an old wooden rocking chair. I had never sat there while she was alive, maybe because I had always been too busy trying to grow up, too busy trying to prove I was worthy. But today, I sat down. The breeze was soft. The faint scent of lavender drifted from the flower bed by the fence. Birds called somewhere far away. Nothing extraordinary, and yet my heart quietly opened. I realized peace doesn't come from living where there's no noise. It comes when you no longer have to strain yourself to listen to everything. That evening, I opened my journal. A page that had been blank for so long now began again. The day I stopped waiting for an apology that would never come. The day I realized true love doesn't come from blood ties, but from choice. I wrote more than I expected. No bitterness, no accusations, just recording, as a witness to my own journey. On the last line, I wrote, I don't need anyone to validate my worth anymore. I survived. No more than that. I've lived authentically. Around 10 p.m., I got a message from Sophie, my friend in New York. Just finished reviewing the final files. Elena, You handled everything so flawlessly. I have nothing left to advise you. Just want to say I'm proud of you." I laughed softly. Such a short message, yet warmer than all the grand words I had once longed to hear from someone else. Not because Sophie is a legal professional, but because she sees me as a person, not a tool, not an investment, not an emotional bargaining chip. I used to believe I needed forgiveness to feel loved, but the truth is, I just needed to be seen for who I really am. And now, I see myself. I'm not perfect. I've been angry, harsh, even vengeful. But I've also loved, protected, and dared to say no. And if that's not mature love, then what is close to midnight? I turned off the lights and climbed the stairs. No dreams waiting for me, no nightmares hiding beneath the pillow. Only me, and the complete silence of a night, owing nothing more to the past. I didn't intend to make this public, truly. I thought that once everything had settled, I would let it slip into silence like a chapter quietly closing. A storm passed through, leaving a bit of chaos behind. But eventually, the garden would bloom again. But life has its own way of reminding us. The truth is never meant to be hidden. It started with a handwritten letter. It arrived at the company office, written in blue ink, every stroke neat and deliberate. "Dear Elena, my name is Sylvia Peterson. I don't know you, but I once knew your parents, a long time ago. I came across the article about the inheritance lawsuit, and I need to tell you this, you're not the only one who was ever left behind." At the bottom was a phone number. I froze. I held that letter in my hand the entire afternoon, as though it carried heat. I spoke with Mrs. Peterson 3 days later, sitting in Aunt Vivien's kitchen, the same place where I once crammed for my junior year chemistry exams. Her voice was soft, raspy, but steady. In 2004, my husband and I adopted a 3-year-old girl. The biological mother said she couldn't raise her because of temporary circumstances. But after we finalized the guardianship papers, she disappeared. That mother's name was Lorraine Kingsley. My grip tightened on the phone. And the man with her, was it Daniel McAllister? Yes. They said they'd come back. They never did. Right after that call, I spoke with an attorney in Denver who had worked in child protection for over 20 years. He told me he had heard whispers before about a couple who repeatedly arranged temporary guardianships, only to later return when there was financial gain involved. No one had ever dared to come forward. There was never any solid proof. People feared being countersued. Most didn't want to be dragged into an exhausting legal spiral. But now, my case had become precedent. Within a month, 3 more families came forward. One was a former bank employee. One had worked as a babysitter. One was the sister of someone who had once taken in a child informally. They all had one thing in common: they'd had dealings with Lorraine and Daniel between 1999 and 2012. And they all shared the same promise: the child would be returned to the biological parents once things got better. No one ever came back. I didn't know what I felt reading through each of those statements. Anger. Yes. Shock, absolutely. But more than anything, emptiness. Not because I didn't care, but when a truth grows so large that it stretches beyond personal boundaries, it stops being my story alone. It becomes the story of so many others who were abandoned and forced to grow up without answers. So, I decided to do one small thing. I hosted an open talk at a local library with the title, "It's Not Your Fault." I told my story. I held nothing back. No sugarcoating. And then I opened the floor for others to speak. A woman in her 50s wept as she spoke about her younger brother, who was sent away temporarily and never came back. A young man shared how his foster mother had simply wrapped him in her arms without asking why he'd been abandoned, only saying, "You're here now." And that's what matters. I watched them, listened to them, and for the first time, I didn't feel different. I was just one part of something much bigger, a collective pain that had once been buried in silence, now finally finding its voice. There are endings that do not need applause. No theatrics, no gavel striking 3 times in a room heavy with silence. Just a single, short, decisive sentence, and the kind of silence that follows, so weighty that no one dares to breathe too loudly. The final hearing took place on an early autumn morning. Denver County Civil Court, courtroom 7B, high ceilings, cold lighting, and old, dark wooden furniture. I sat in the 3rd row, behind Mr. Thompson's table. Lorraine and Daniel sat on the opposite side, their faces pale, their gazes scattered. They had a new attorney, a younger woman who looked more exhausted than sharp. This was no longer a simple, private dispute. The court had consolidated 3 other complaints into this case, each revolving around the same pattern of exploiting temporary guardianship, disappearing, and then resurfacing once assets were secured. The term systematic fraud came directly from the prosecution. I didn't look at them when the prosecutor read the statements. I didn't look when photos of the recorded transcripts were presented. I didn't look when the other families, Mrs. Peterson, the young man from the library, and the talk were called up one by one to testify. I just listened and kept my heart as still as a lake untouched by wind. The judge was a woman in her early 50s, her silver hair tied neatly back, her voice deep and steady, like the ticking of a wall clock. When she began reading the verdict, I felt as though I wasn't hearing individual words, but rather sensing each weight, like stones being lifted from my chest, based on clear evidence, including transfer records, recorded audio, handwritten letters, and consistent testimonies from multiple unrelated witnesses. The court finds that the actions of Mr. Daniel McAllister and Mrs. Lorraine Kingsley not only violate familial ethics, but also constitute abuse of guardianship authority with elements of financial exploitation. The court hereby declares the request for inheritance division is denied in full. Any further appeals will be restricted for a period of 5 years. Any unauthorized financial interference, media involvement, or personal contact with the plaintiff will be subject to civil penalties. This case is closed. There was no applause, only the soft creak of a wooden bench as someone shifted in their seat. I didn't stand up right away. I looked down at my hands resting on my lap, calm, steady, not trembling. This was not a victory. This was an ending. Lorraine left the courtroom faster than I expected. She didn't cry. She didn't scream like she had outside my house that day. She just bowed her head, shoulders slumped, and walked straight out the door like a ghost draped in wool. Daniel, on the other hand, held on to a fragment of dignity by shaking hands with his attorney, nodding at the judge, and then brushing past me as if we were strangers passing at a train station. We had become exactly what they feared most people who share blood but no longer share history. That night, I sat in the home library, the room Vivien once used to draft her meticulous strategic notes, like she was commanding a chessboard. I lit a small candle, not for remembrance, but to declare closure. On the desk lay 3 case files stamped in red closed. At the bottom drawer rested a folder marked McAllister and Kingsley, sealed permanently. And on the wall, the same wooden frame bore the words Vivien once carved into it. We don't choose where we begin, but we always have the right to choose how we end. I placed my hand on those words, closing my eyes, not to escape, but to listen to something small, fragile, and deeply real within me. Peace. I used to think that letting go would come like a clap of thunder, decisive, resounding, clear as a conclusion. But it turns out, it's more like a thin breeze brushing past your neck on a late afternoon. No one hears it. Only you feel it. A week after the trial, I booked a ticket to Maine. No meeting schedules, no laptop, just a small bag, an old book of Vivien's, and a film camera I had left forgotten in a drawer for 3 years. No one knew I was leaving. No one needed to know. I just needed to quietly step away from a place that had witnessed too many collisions to remind myself that I still had choices where to go, how to live, and what to love. I spent the first 3 days doing nothing but sleeping and walking. One afternoon, I found myself stopping at a little seaside bookstore. On the shelf sat a small notebook resting against a hardcover book. Some chapters deserve to end with silence. I bought it instantly, didn't even care what was inside, because I knew sometimes a single sentence like that is enough. When I came back to Denver, the season had changed. Leaves were falling more heavily. The air had grown crisper. And inside the house, Vivien's bookshelf remained exactly the same. I didn't rearrange anything. I only added one new frame, a picture of me standing on the cliffs at Portland Head Light, arms stretched wide, hair tangled, eyes closed, the wind slamming into me as if testing whether I had the courage to truly live. Vivien would be proud. I know she would. Not because I won the lawsuit, not because I kept the inheritance, but because I didn't lose myself in the noise of those who once abandoned me. With each passing day, I began stepping back from the roles I had carried for so long, the heir, the representative, the one who bore the weight of responsibility. I am the kind of woman who prefers wildflowers over cut bouquets, who likes scribbling notes by hand more than managing life through an app, who finally realizes that I don't need anyone's approval to live fully, and that is enough. Not too much, not too little, enough to breathe. Enough to rewrite my chapter, no longer a footnote in someone else's story. You know, I'm no longer angry at Lorraine. I no longer resent Daniel, because holding on to resentment still ties me to them. Forgiveness isn't about them deserving it. It's about me deserving peace. Some bridges must be burned, not to punish anyone, but so there's no way back to a place that once broke you. If you've stayed with me until now, thank you. Because staying isn't something everyone can do. And if you find yourself somewhere inside this story, even just a little, leave a comment below. I want to hear from you. Truly. Tell me, what bridge did you have to burn to save yourself? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, share this video with someone you think might need it. And don't forget to hit subscribe on Bitter Scars, a place where we don't just tell the wounds, but where every scar learns how to tell a brave and beautiful story.